The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
You've always got time for Short Time.
Hey, it's Warren Lopez.
David Taylor.
Brent Metcalf. Johnny Hendricks. Tony Ramos. Bubba J.
Mike Golick.
Matthew Modine.
The one and only Chael Sonnen, and you are listening to the one and only Short Time Wrestling Podcast by the often imitated and never duplicated Jason Bryant.
Now up on the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, we're going to do something I don't do very often, and that's talk books, because as a college student for 7 years, I didn't read a lot of them. But now I have a reason to read, and it's the slew of wrestling books that have come out recently. This book that we're talking about today, called Stephen Florida, we are here with the author, Gabe Habash. He's going to talk to us about the formulation of the book, the wrestling story behind it, and a few things that might jump out at you and surprise you. But before we even get to the book and the novel, Gabe, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
First thing I want to say, I almost called you Steven right off the bat. So it's one of the things. I just read this thing. And for those wondering, I discovered it through a BuzzFeed story with an excerpt. And the first thing that jumped out at me was kind of the realism of the wrestling story. So what made you want to write a novel? And this is a fiction novel. This is not based on a true story, although there's some questions later I want to ask about. But what was the first idea to say, I'm going to write a story about wrestling?
Yeah, so the way that I, as a fiction writer, approach writing, this is the third book I've written, but it's the first one that's been published. The way that I approach writing is this sort of like gathering system where I think about various things that I want to write about and I combine them. And then when I have enough of those elements together in one package, then I can actually start the first draft and begin in earnest. And the wrestling aspect of the book actually came about really early when I sort of started thinking about how I've always loved books about books and movies and any type of story really about someone who's very obsessed and monomaniacally driven to pursue one thing. Like There Will Be Blood is one of my favorite movies, and Fitzcarraldo, the Werner Herzog movie with Klaus Kinski, is another one of my favorites. There's a book called Remainder by Tom McCarthy that's about this guy who sort of like suffers this head trauma when this mysterious object falls out of the sky and hits him in the head. And he sort of tries to create this like weird world and reconstruct it. And it's him trying to improve it and improve it and improve it for 200 pages. And so I thought about that type of mentality and why I found that so fascinating and how I could approach that from a way that was my own. And I've always been fascinated with wrestling. And I figured that someone who would commit to wrestling, which I always thought was such a demanding and unforgiving and specific sport, that was a way to put that psychology into a container. So that's how the wrestling aspect came about, which was very early on.
Yeah, because most people, when they say they're fascinated with the sport of wrestling, actually have some wrestling background. You don't have
Right.
much, if any.
Right. Yeah, I didn't have any. And that was actually part of the draw, because when I write, I don't like to write anything close to my own experience. Like I work in book publishing in New York, and the last thing I would ever want to write is a book set in New York. So I thought about
The most opposite thing from New York
Exactly.
City, middle of North Dakota.
Yeah, and that was the other thing, is I picked the book is set in central North Dakota at a fictional college, and I picked central North Dakota similar to wrestling. I had never been to North Dakota before starting to write the book, and I wanted a blank slate. I wanted the most isolated place I could think of, and sort of to amplify the solitude and loneliness of the main character's goal to win the 133 championship.
Now, we're going to get to spoilers later on. We're not going to spoil it in the first 10 minutes of the show here, because there are some things here that are definitely pertinent to the story that I have questions about. So if you haven't read the book yet, you can go about 10 more minutes into the show, hit pause, come back on the show, and after you finish it, you'll get the answers to some of those questions, I hope, or you can leave it cryptic, as some authors like to do. Now, the one thing that was remarkable about this, as I was reading it, and again, this isn't blowing smoke, but I sat there and I started opening it, and in reading a simple review, I tried to avoid the reviews if possible. to get an understanding of this book. Kind of like you went into North Dakota with the blank slate. I went in with no preconceived notions of this. And for somebody that has zero wrestling background, the imagery and the techniques and the terminology used, I found to be pretty much spot on. And this is from somebody who gets all, bent out of shape about misapplication of certain terminology in our sport. So what really helped you understand the terminology and the moves that go along with trying to write a story about a sport that you don't have experience in?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just talk chronologically how I approached that throughout the process. I started, I read some books. I read A Season on the Mat about Gable, the biography. I read, I think it's called 4 Days to Glory or something
Mark
like
Kreidler.
that. Yeah, I read that. And I love the movie Foxcatcher. I read the Schultz book that's also called Foxcatcher, that came out, I think, after the movie did. But I think the movie Foxcatcher came out after I had gotten pretty deep into it. The book I started writing in July 2013. So I think Foxcatcher was after that. But I did a little bit of reading, but the main thing I did was just internet. I just went. I would watch like infinite hours of YouTube. I would just like type in wrestling matches and in YouTube and in Google, and I would like look at the video results, and it would just lead me down these rabbit holes. And I tried to envision the matches in the book from a visual standpoint first and foremost. I didn't want to like try to write them from the inside out. I wanted to try to write them from the outside in and get closer and closer, because the book is first person through Steven's perspective. So we do get that really interior vision of the match, but I started from the outside and sort of worked my way in, I guess, if that makes sense. And then in terms of incorporating the wrestling terminology, I would find, a particular maneuver, or I would sort of know the bare bones of how a match would play out. There's a couple matches in the book. There's not a ton of them, because I didn't want to make the book this sort of like series of matches. There had to be room for other things in the book. So I tried to limit them as much as possible. But once I knew like roughly the bare bones of the matches, then I would be able to go further and further into, moment by moment in the match. And then after the book had been finished, I gave it to a family friend of mine, Ian McCutcheon, who has been involved in wrestling his whole life, and he gave the book a read and cleaned up a lot of the errors that I had in there. And that was, a lot of credit to Ian for the book passing the sniff test for you. I don't think it probably would have been that successful without him.
Yeah, not surprising.
It definitely wouldn't have been.
I've known Ian. I've met him a couple times, so I know exactly who you're referring to there. So pretty good guy to use in that respect. Yeah,
he was definitely instrumental, and he's in the acknowledgments for a very, very good reason.
Now, as we get to the book, as we talked about prior to starting this interview, I grew up reading a lot of fiction sports novels, and when I was in middle school, I think this is really where it started. There was a guy named Thomas Dygard, who I believe passed away around 1979, 1980. He wrote like 40 books that were all based around like a star player overcoming something. And they were at fictitious colleges. And it was like, wait a minute. This is like an adult version of like Power Back or Outside Shooter. I mean, they all had like the tournament upstart. They all had like really like kind of names that would go through, and the story was like, okay, here's the adversity that this athlete's going through, and they were for young readers. Now, as I started reading through Stephen Florida, and I'm like, this is like those books with a fake ID and a bit of a drinking problem. I mean, it was like such an adult version. I mean, it was a cross between that, and I remember the first sports novel I ever read that had some foul language in it, because this is a story about a college athlete. So yes, there's going to be F-bombs. There's going to be some graphic type of explanations of certain situations, but it was like Sometimes You See It Coming, which is a novel by a guy named Kevin Baker about a fictitious baseball player. And it merged all those things I loved about sports books into one, plus wrestling. So as a fan reader, you nailed my demographic immediately. But is there a worry at all that wrestling purists might look at this thing and be like, oh, that's not going to promote the sport of wrestling?
Oh yeah, for sure. That was like my number one concern because I mean, like I wasn't worried about offending people who live in central North Dakota because nobody lives there. So that was not like, the two aspects of the book that are most removed from my own experience are the wrestling aspect and the setting. And, that was obviously something I was worried about from day one, which is why I was so reliant on Ian's input. And, like I'm sure this is my own experience, but I'm sure other writers who are, tackling things that aren't their own experience have the same anxiety because you never really know because it's not your experience. So that was the thing that I was always concerned about. And I hoped that I could find ways to make it vague and approach it from a way that would limit the opportunities for showing any ignorance or mistakes. I try to limit the wrestling as much as possible to close those cracks, if that makes sense. And and from a quantity standpoint, like if there's less wrestling, there's less opportunities for me to say something that's not going to check out for someone who's been wrestling their whole life.
Because one thing as I thought as I was reading it was like, I found this very intriguing because I said to my wife, I says, I don't think anybody that actually is from the wrestling community could have written something like this for, I guess, the fear of the blowback for, not being able to, oh, well, that's crap. I'm just thinking about the haters immediately as I read this. Like, I don't think I could have written this type of story because, the closeness, and you'd think you'd be pulling people as inspirations for characters. I mean, how do you pull inspiration for characters like this without the knowledge of how wrestlers act?
That's a good question. I guess I didn't really pull from any specific model. I mean, the emotional aspects of the book were very true to my own experience. So in that sense, a lot of I viewed wrestling and some of the other elements in the book as this sort of vehicle to express the. Stephen goes through some severe depression during the book, and so that was a driving force in how I could use. I don't want to call wrestling window dressing because that's reductive, but it was like a method. It was a means to an end to express what I wanted to express about the character. Because I do think the wrestling is obviously very integral to the book, but I don't think of it as a wrestling book or a sports book. I think of it as a book with wrestling in it. And I do think that the best sports narratives, whether it be books or movies, are successful or make a lasting impression on the reader or the viewer because of what they say about humanity or humans beyond what they just engaging with whatever sport they're engaging with. Like I think Foxcatcher works both as a wrestling movie, but also works because it explores the DuPont story and explores like what happens when someone gets unchecked power and like Hoop Dreams. I'm a big basketball fan. Hoop Dreams is, I think, the best sports movie ever made. It's a documentary, but I still consider it a movie. And that movie is amazing, not because of the basketball, but because of how epic the scope is of following the two students through high school and college. But the basketball is the means that allows the story to be told, but it's not about the basketball per se. So yeah, I would say that the wrestling was obviously important or one of the most important parts of the book to get right. But at the end of the day, it wasn't the first and last. It wasn't the alpha and the omega, I guess.
When it compares to the other two books, you said you've written 3 books. This is the first one published. What sets this one apart from the other 2?
That's also a really good question. The first book, so I've been trying to write novels since college. The first book I wrote was my undergrad thesis, and it was bad, and I never intended to publish it. I never showed it to anybody except my thesis advisor, who was an angel and the only person who had to suffer through it. But yeah, that was like just a sort of a test run to like prove to myself that I could write a novel. And then the second book I wrote in grad school, and that one I had an agent for, and it didn't sell, and that was an extremely difficult and frustrating process. And being an author, you sort of just have to deal with a lot of rejection, and the process is very drawn out. Like I said earlier, I started writing this book in 2013, and it just came out, this month. So it's a very long process, and this book in particular was certainly informed by the fact that the last book didn't sell. That was a huge disappointment to me. Now I feel like it was all worth it to not. I don't dislike the last book that didn't sell, but I do think that it was certainly weaker than this book, and I'm overall pleased that this was the first book that I had published, because I'm very happy with it. And in terms of how those other books informed this one, I certainly put a lot of the frustrations and, like I said earlier, the emotional aspects of the book are certainly informed by the experiences with the first two books that I wrote.
And were the first two books, were they sports oriented?
No, not at all.
So you're breaking the pattern completely.
Yep. Yeah. And that's like that. Yeah. Not to like beat a dead horse, but it was really the thing that pushed me through the book. The first draft of the writing process is how different it was from everything that I knew. And it was, I mean, the number one thing that you don't want to have when you're writing a book is be bored. Because if you're bored, that's going to come through in your writing, and your readers are going to be bored if you ever get fortunate enough to publish the book. So, yeah, all of the elements that I incorporated into the book were all exciting to me and were, surprising. Like, I didn't know exactly where the book was. I knew how it was going to end and that it was going to take place over his single senior season, but I didn't know a lot of the middle parts of the book and what sort of side turns it would take. So the first draft was very exciting to me, because it was a process of discovery, and probably not that different from the feeling that the reader hopefully gets in reading the book, because I didn't know exactly where it was going either for a lot of the writing.
Now, centering on the story, as we said, it's a senior at a fictitious college, and when you went fictitious college, you didn't just go fictitious college; you went fictitious division, because we've got the NCAA has 3 divisions: Division 1, Division 2, Division 3. You went Division 4 on this. You put it out in the middle of North Dakota. And living here in Minnesota, I'm sitting there. I'm picturing the campus of North Dakota State, but I'm also picturing it like in Jamestown. And you're mentioning towns in Minnesota like Winona and Thief River Falls, and I'm like, I felt like I could kind of identify the landscape as I'm reading it. But why the names of the schools are what they are, and again, why Division 4? Is there something with something from a writing story where you have to mention somebody's school name? If you say Ohio State, that school gets a certain cut or permission. I mean, how does that work and using real names or fictitious names?
Yeah, the like permissions aspect was not ever a part of it. Like you can mention Ohio State and you don't have to owe them any money. It's if you I think the only thing is if you have like song lyrics or anything that's copyrighted, if you quote from that at length, I think you're allowed to quote a certain amount of words from like a song lyric before it becomes, you have to get permission to use it, and then you have to pay. But in terms of like institutions like Ohio State, you don't have to. That's not on the table. So that was not part of it. But yeah, I did want to avoid any sort of affiliations to real places, because I did want this to be a sort of parallel world to the one that we inhabit. And the reason why that was so important to me is because the book is told through the first person, through Stephen's perspective, and is I'm sure if anybody's listening to this and has started to read the book, or people who started will very quickly see that Stephen's perspective is very warped, and as the book progresses, it gets more and more disoriented, and his psychology starts to unravel a little bit. So that sort of parallel world of Division 4 with fictional colleges, and that goes along with the setting, like the most remote place in the country, or one of the more remote places in the country. Those were all to amplify that sort of psychology. but yeah, I didn't want to. I didn't, and the Division 4 specifically, I didn't want to make him a Division 1 athlete who was, being televised and like had all of this exposure, because that to me was never interesting to have like a star athlete. I wanted someone who was good, but in the book, it's his only scholarship offer is the college he goes to, and it's obviously a fictitious or fictional division. And so I wanted someone who was like good, but how good they were is relative. And I wanted that to also, like, he was sort of pursuing something that nobody cared about. And if he was, wrestling for Ohio State or Oklahoma State or Iowa or any of those, powerhouse programs, it's just not, that doesn't have that potency, that like disconnect between how much he cares about it and how little everybody else cares about it.
Yeah, almost like, this guy's got a dream and an aspiration, but it's his. It's not like, say, like you said, Iowa, where the program hopes are being a national champion versus
right.
A lot of people know that this guy's going for his national championship, whereas Division 4, I mean, the wrestling community generally ignores the smaller divisions, and this guy has got his own personal, let's borrow another book and a movie out of it, his own personal vision quest, as warped as it may be, to try to win a national championship, when maybe just the 2,000 people in. Again, Kenosha is the spot you choose for the national championships, very Midwestern type of wrestling town. So, I mean, are there any comparisons, I guess, to other things you may have read that kind of gave you an idea? Is okay, because this is like, I don't want to compare it, but I'm asking, is there a comparison to something like a Vision Quest where Loudon Swain's character is like, I've got to beat Shoot?
You mean in specifically, like, was there like an analog for some other source material that I sort of adapted into a specific aspect of the book, or just in general?
More the narrative in terms of like because that particular movie and book is a young adult coming of age type of book,
right.
If for lack of a better term. How would you classify this in comparison to, say, a coming of age book or film?
Well, yeah, it's definitely coming of age. I mean, he's a senior. He's 21 years old. He's graduating. And I mean, coming of age is it's sort of like, I guess it's been, the term has sort of just been narrowed a little bit. And when we say coming of age, it seems like more, if it's more aimed for younger readers. But I mean, that's a very broad term. Like, it's anything that applies to a story where someone is like becoming the person they will be. And that's ultimately what the book's about. It's his senior season. And it's sort of this fulcrum point in his life where at the end of the season, which is where the book ends, you're going to try to see where his life is going to go after that, because it's something he's committed to for the bulk of his life. I mean, this is not a spoiler. His parents have died in a car accident about 10 years earlier. That's revealed in the first 10 pages. He's by himself. He's been sort of putting all of his eggs in one basket in pursuing this one thing, the 133 championship, for so long. And it's sort of some of the drama at the periphery or the thing that is like the timer that's starting to tick down as the book is going towards its conclusion, is you as the reader know, and Stephen knows, that his season is going to end at a set point in March, assuming he gets to the championship. And he's distantly aware as that approaches, and increasingly aware that he's going to have to figure out what he's going to do after that, because he has sort of neglected a lot of opportunities he's had in terms of his classes and relationships with other people, because of how much he's put into pursuing the wrestling. And so it's definitely coming of age in that sense. In terms of influences, I'm not sure I had any sort of sports narratives that heavily influenced it. I think it was just sort of like little pieces here and there. I would say that one of the best stories that I've read that's sports, and again, it's not maybe what we would consider a sports story, is this short story by Annie Proulx, which is in her story collection Close Range, which also has a story that Brokeback Mountain was based on. And it's the story called The Mud Below, and it's this 40-page short story. It's almost like it's like a novella almost. It's like 40 pages. and it covers this rodeo rider's life. And that, if you read that story, I'm sure you would see the parallels between mine and that, where the main character, starts to ride in the rodeos, and that's like this like rare moment of feeling alive, and it's intermixed with all of these scenes with his personal life where he's having difficulties with his mother, and he's sort of just traveling around the West to all these different rodeos, and that was definitely something that I really admired about that story.
I want to circle back to now. We might get into some spoiler range here, so those of you who haven't quite gotten to the book yet, this from here on out, there might be some stuff that gives away things at certain parts. But the first question here isn't really one, but it's one we've gotten from one of the people who started reading the book based on our Facebook group at Mad Talk Online and facebook.com/group/Mad Talk Online. If you're a patron of the Mad Talk Podcast Network, you can get access to those conversations. And it's about, why did you choose 133 pounds? Is there a specific reason that this guy is 133?
I picked 133 because, wow, this is a really specific question, and I never in my wildest dreams thought I would answer this. But I guess when I was thinking of the weight class, I wanted someone who was roughly my body type. When I was not having wrestled, my sort of parallel to Steven's obsession with wrestling, not that I ever got as far as Steven gets in the book, or I hope I'm not as unhinged as he is, but I ran cross country through high school, and when I was like really in the thick of it, I'm roughly Steven's. I'm not 133 anymore, but when I was like really doing it, yeah, that was roughly how I thought of it. Is like he would be around 133, and he's 5'8" or so, or 5'6" or 5'7", and that was how I sort of picked it. I knew I didn't want like a higher weight class was the other thing, because I wanted it to be one of the lower ones.
And another question that came out of that discussion was about the literacy level, or the knowledge base, or the intelligence of Stephen Florida, the character, and trying to write him from a perspective of you being very educated and him coming off maybe not as educated. Did you feel that was kind of a almost a conundrum to feel like, okay, I don't know what this is like. Am I writing down to this? Or your
right.
own impressions on what a middling, borderline educated college athlete in a low level sport is?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. His intelligence was something I went back and forth on. Like, I agonized over what his GPA should be, and like I would like email my editors like, do you think this is too low? Do you like, what is, like, if someone has this GPA, do you think that, like, what is that type of person, like, what does that signal to you? And I sort of like overthought it, maybe, because I think that Stephen is actually very intelligent, and he just chooses to neglect the things that he doesn't have any interest in. So he comes across as like he doesn't care about his classes, which is totally true, because he doesn't. So he sort of does the bare minimum in his classes because he just doesn't want to waste his time doing it. And so that was also an interesting dynamic to me. The other thing is his intelligence is sort of like fluctuates during the course of the book. I don't know if you felt that way when you were reading it, but he'll like come across as very like emotionally or mentally like not super intelligent, and then in another scene he'll be very perceptive about something, and that was also very interesting to me, as having someone who was sort of dynamic from a mental standpoint. Like he sort of shifts throughout the book, and that was very interesting for me to write about.
One thing we discussed before we got started was one of the initial questions I had is the timeline of this, and your answer. I'm going to ask you to kind of restate that that answer as I said. When is this supposed to be set? Because again, spoiler alert, there's really not any mentions of cell phones or internet or the technology that wrestling fans are used to seeing these days. And you've got an interesting theory as to why.
Yeah. So it's sort of that answer I gave a little earlier, how I wanted it to be sort of this parallel world. But I did, similarly to the GPA with my editor, I did work I did talk to him. We sort of went through the entire book and found anything that would timestamp the book. And it's intentionally supposed to be vague. Like Jason said, there's very little technology. But I didn't want it to ever be like set in this particular year. And there's a number of reasons to do why I wanted to do that, but the latest timestamp that I was aware of that I wanted to work with was one of the characters reads Stephen King's The Stand, which was, I believe, published in 1979. So the way that I generally think about the book is that it could exist anywhere between 79 and today. And just in terms of like logistics of telling a story, like I feel like cell phones and the internet just sort of suck a lot of the drama and suspense out of things. Like if you can just easily look something up on the internet, I mean, it would have been a very different book if those things were in the book. And so by not having them in there, that allowed me to take the book in a different direction and sort of amplify Stephen's, again, his solitude and his loneliness if he's sort of in this place that feels disconnected, not only spatially and geographically, but also if there's no technology connecting him to the world around him.
Why did you decide to choose certain cities like you did for certain characters? You mentioned Thief River Falls and the diner in Winona. These, again, because of living in Minnesota, these things jumped out at me, and I think Midwestern readers might also see the same thing. Having gone to Fargo, which is like a big central point for young wrestlers, the junior nationals that take place there every year. But you identified it in a place that's really known for the Upper Midwest as a wrestling kind of area. But any particular reasons, or did you visit those places and say, this will be good for the book?
Yeah, I've been to Minnesota really briefly, but I sort of, along with the same reason why I picked Central North Dakota as where Stephen goes to college, I didn't have any of those places in mind from any sort of experience with them in my past. I actually just would go, it became like a logistical thing because one of the problems that arose, going back to the last answer, because you don't know when the book is set, they're always riding in buses to places. So, I don't know how many Division I schools or even, I don't know how many wrestling teams take flights. I mean, I'm assuming if you have to go across the country, you have to take a plane, but I didn't want to introduce that aspect into the book. So all of the wrestling in the book is in a regional distance from where Stephen is. So everything is reachable by bus. So just in terms of a logistical issue that I needed to solve, everything needed to be within a bus ride distance of Central North Dakota. And I would pick the various towns based on where the other characters. There's one character who leaves the story and moves to the east, and I had to pick a place between between North Dakota and Michigan to sort of like get the halfway point between those two. So it was basically like solving the problems in the story spatially.
Yeah, because I'm sitting there, I go to a map, I'm like, does this place exist? I'm just curious, because it's right down there. Off of 61, my buddy has a cabin right off along the Mississippi, off of 61. So I know exactly. It's weird. Maybe this is something that I'm just, because I live here, it makes that much more. It felt like it was more real to me. But as we move through the story, there is some. We talk about how Stephen Florida's warped sense, again, spoiler alert, of issues, but there are just some reactions that seem to be a little off the wall. But when I realize and look at my experience, because I live with wrestlers, I didn't wrestle in college, but I was around, 27 wrestlers at some point for over a 7-year span of my undergraduate career. I saw them do some crazy stuff, and I saw them do some borderline questionable stuff, and I was like, what the heck? And then I think, okay, this is far-fetched. Well, where does some of these far-fetched things that Stephen Florida gets into that a rational reader would think this is an irrational thing, this is unrealistic? Where does that actually become believable from the aspect of a college athlete's mind, of a kid who's got some deep-rooted emotional issues here?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the psychology, I sort of wanted to fill in. Stephen's psychology sort of fills in as it goes. I mean, at the outset that his parents are dead and his grandmother's died and he's basically by himself. And so in terms of some of the more out there and crazy antics that he gets himself into, yes, he does some weird things that I think that most normal people would never think of doing. But in terms of how I thought about him from a psychological standpoint, I actually thought of him as sort of someone who is put in solitary confinement for a long period of time, because he doesn't have any real meaningful relationships. And there are hints at the beginning. I'm trying not to talk about what happens in the later part of the book, but in the beginning, you'll see him drop hints that he's had, some relationships in the past that have, fallen by the wayside or failed for whatever reason. And those things all add up and contribute to his sort of detached and removed perspective. And the question of writing it from first person, I had one person ask me if I ever considered writing it from third person, and that never ever dawned on me, because you just wouldn't have the access to all of the wrinkles in Stephen's perspective. You could write close third, but it wouldn't have the immediacy that first person does. And one of the other things that I was really interested in exploring is the disconnect between, if you think about some of the scenes where Stephen is in a room or in a scene where he's with other characters and there's talking. Stephen, if you were to look at that scene and film it as a movie and not give any access to what Stephen is thinking, Stephen like barely talks and comes across in a lot of the scenes as this sort of like I don't know if he's I don't want to say intimidating, but he's sort of removed from the rest of the team, and a lot of them sort of view him as like a weirdo, and he sort of gives one word answers a lot of the time, or doesn't answer at all. And that was something that was very fascinating to me, is like, hopefully the reader would, enter these scenes and sort of take a step back at some point or another and say like, oh, well, what does Stephen look like to the people around him? And like, how, like, and sort of try to reconcile that with what level of access you get as a reader, and what does that do about how much you sympathize with him, or what is having access to knowledge that the other characters in the book don't have? What does that do to your impression of Stephen? And I've gotten a couple questions about his likability, and that certainly is informed by that aspect of the book, is like how his likability is altered by the fact that we find out what Stephen like actually thinks about things. Whereas if it was third person, he might be maybe a little bit less sympathetic or harder to root for, I guess.
Do you see him sometimes maybe as perhaps a borderline anti-hero?
Yeah, for sure. He does some not admirable things in the book. And again, that was sort of going back to the question of his intelligence. That was something that was always more interesting to me. I mean, some of my favorite books and stories and movies also have characters. Characters that are just like totally virtuous are A, not interesting, and B, not believable, because nobody's just like a saint walking around the world and not making mistakes or doing things that they regret or don't regret. And like, mistakes are interesting, and it's how people respond to those mistakes that sort of is the engine for a lot of storytelling. And he was. I like him. He's someone that I very much love and had a lot of fun writing about for years and being with the last couple of years. But yeah, his behavior is certainly not commendable in every situation.
Yeah, and I think, I use that term anti-hero comes around. People look at the comic characters like Deadpool or the AMC, Walter White in Breaking Bad. They see him doing horrible things, but you're rooting for him. Or Saul Goodman in the follow-up or the prequel Better Call Saul. How much do you think that maybe current reader and viewer trends in television and books kind of maybe scoped how you wanted this novel to go?
I don't know how current it is. I guess, yeah. Those shows now, like the longer form, are allowing for like deeper character explorations, and TV is getting better and better. But movies have always been where I've gravitated toward. I would much rather watch a movie than a TV episode on any given night. And to go back to There Will Be Blood, that's like just a textbook example of like someone who's, monomaniacal and sort of pursues this oil empire that he wants to build at the cost of having a relationship with his son, which is to me like one of the most heartbreaking and amazing parts of that movie. And his son actually becomes deaf because of what his dad does. And I think that I think that it's been a long tradition where if you follow a character that you don't exactly love, I mean, maybe they do things that you like, but I think that's just very interesting because that makes the reader think about how they feel about that character and what they see of themselves in that character, and it becomes a sort of like more involved process for the reader and makes them access something that if it was just a superhero who doesn't do anything incorrect, you just are sort of not accessing that emotional and psychological part of humans on a deeper level. So I guess that's what I'd say about that.
When it comes to developing the secondary characters and their place within the story, a couple, there's some jaw-dropping moments here as the book comes on, and you see certain ideas about certain people really come to fruition and some not come to fruition. But when it comes to characters like Linus, his teammate, or Coach Fink, who both have significant roles towards the end of the story, what really was the key in developing what happens to those guys? Again, not to give away what happens, but taking those various paths.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that was a challenge with the book for sure, because the trade-off for picking it to tell the story first person and allow Stephen's voice to be the main engine of the narrative and the main thing that pushes the book along is, so that's the positive, is you have this, like, if you can create that voice that is very strong, you have that as a positive. But at the flip side of it is you have these secondary characters that maybe are harder to create and make them stand up on their own in the face of the like force and momentum of Stephen's voice. So the secondary characters were a challenge for sure because of how powerful Stephen is at the center of the narrative. But yeah, I wanted to make sort of what I said earlier about the disconnect between how Stephen behaves in these situations and how, if you were to like think of them from a more bird's eye view or a third person view, if standing outside of Stephen's voice in his head, and you would hopefully get a sense of those characters hinted at that maybe is a little bit different than the way that Stephen's sort of suffocating voice at times portrays them. And Linus, who is the 125 wrestler on the team and is the only wrestler on the team that's as good as Stephen, that's a core relationship in the book, and I wanted to have their friendship be very believable, but also very messy. So there's some frustration on the part of both of them, and I wanted to make the other characters, especially someone like Linus, both sympathetic in their own right, but also like to understand maybe understand the choices that Stephen makes and how he deals with the other characters as well. And that sort of disconnect between the two was really interesting to me.
Circling back to the setting and picking North Dakota and then some of the terminology, again, why I'm looking at it as somebody who pays attention to wrestling as a lifer, it seemed like your understanding with the timeline is, as far as the school goes, and again, this is a giveaway, it's not a huge part of, it's not going to give away anything in terms of what happens at the end, but saying the school was brought back, it's like looking at current events saying, okay, here was a small school in North Dakota that had wrestling cut by Title IX years ago. It's brought back, but it's never really had any success. And you get an aging coach. I still want to know, were there any institutions that you'd come across in your research and doing this that the school, like, I think that's one that I can kind of picture in this place that I want to have no preconceived notions about, but you know, the name, it doesn't really match, but there's a Berg to it. And in Division III, Augsburg and Wartburg have kind of ruled the roost.
Yeah.
And again, bringing a school back from reinstatement, usually small liberal arts colleges have brought programs back from reinstatement, having been cut 20, 25 years ago. So from an educational standpoint, what college landscapes may have provided an inspirational spark for Augsburg?
Yeah. So the name, or it's Oregsburg, is the name of Stevens College. And that, like, just from a name standpoint, that was based on Augsburg. But that was not, that's the beginning and end of it. That it was not meant to be a stand-in for that. In terms of a school that I based it on, I guess the only thing that would be close, the only thing that I would say that it was any sort of reality based move on my part was I had one scholarship offer to run cross country in college, and that was a small school in Pennsylvania, and that was also a program that had just started up recently. And I went to look at the school, and I didn't ever really have any intention of going there because I may have continued to run cross country in college, but I didn't think I wanted to. Ultimately, I went to school in Florida for film and writing, but the other, like, sort of one little aspect of the book that sort of pushed me forward when I was initially conceiving of it is, what if I had gone to this Pennsylvania school and run cross country, and I was never good enough to run for a big program, and I don't even know. I don't know if it was their first year having the team or it was like a couple years in, but they obviously were, reaching down to me, I guess, in Ohio. But that was interesting to me, is like, oh, if I had gone to this school, how would my life be different? And that's not to say that I'm, the autobiographical elements of Stephen as a character are not super profound or prodigious, but we do have some things in common, I would suppose, especially emotional. And but yeah, that was sort of something that I was interested in. Like, if I went to this small school in Pennsylvania, and my whole reason for being there was because I was there for running in cross country, how would that college experience have been different than what I had in my real life?
And with the experience for Stephen Florida, again, the lead character in the novel with the same name, there are the two finishing points of the book. Again, not to explain what happens, but the 2 points that jump out to me. One is the competition aspect of it and how that finishes up, and then how the whole story itself ends up. What were your thoughts on how to go with both sides of those situations, and why did you ultimately come to the conclusions you did with both the competition and the finale of the novel?
So when you say the finale, you mean the thing that happens after the competition?
Yes, the basically
Okay.
last page.
Yes,
what
right.
ends the book?
I will try to speak appropriately vague.
Yeah, because I don't want to give it away, because I want people to read
Right.
it, because I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Right. So I guess I knew how the book was going to end very early on, and I definitely knew that it was going to end at the end of his season. And then there is something else at the end of the book, that it doesn't just end with the final match and, like, him, like, walking off the mat in defeat or in victory. That's not, like, the end of the book, because it's not, the book, as I said earlier, is not a sports book exclusively. It's a book with sports in it. So it doesn't begin and end with his season, although that's the main container. But yeah, the end of the book, it's difficult because I don't want to color anyone's interpretation of the ending by telling them how I crafted it, or what my thinking was behind it. But I guess I would say, going back to what I said earlier about a coming of age story, is that I did want there to be the sense that the book was moving towards this conclusion where Stephen has to figure out what's going to happen when wrestling is no longer the center of his life. And whether that's resolved, how that's resolved is sort of open-ended. But that the wrestling is meant to be there and then to just sort of drop off. And it's in its own way, it's another thing in his life, along with his parents and the people that he's cared about in his life. Wrestling has been the support system that he is going to lose, and he knows it. So he's experienced this trauma and these tragedies in his life where his parents have died in a car accident, his grandmother has just passed away, and he's had some relationships with other people that have, dissolved, and he's sort of taken those bruises and bumps and cuts into him and sort of moved on. Wrestling is another thing in that line of support system that he is losing, and I think that's a fundamental part of becoming who we will become and growing up, is learning to lose and say goodbye to the things that have supported us for the earlier parts of our lives when we're becoming the person that we're going to be.
One more thing that I do want to get on. Actually, it was actually early in the book, and it's something that as we got talking, it kind of slipped my mind as I come back, is the fact that the difference between his name and his name. And those of you who start reading the book will understand exactly what I mean by that. And it's kind of it was a point of confusion for me initially. I had to go back and reread it. But why is that part of the narrative?
That's a good question too. Yeah. So this is not really a spoiler. It's given away on page like 20. It's really not very far into the book. He reveals his real name, which I will not say. But his real name is not Stephen Florida. It is something very similar. But there's a reason for why his name is Stephen Florida and it's not his real name. And I think that was not a huge plot point, but I do think it does something to the reader I don't know if it's like a subtle level. I don't know how subtle it is because it is his name. So it is like, you do sort of think it every time his name is mentioned and you're like, oh, well, that's not his real name. But it is in there for, I guess, mainly the reason of the sort of persona he's created for himself, because he is so in his own headspace, in his own mind, that he has sort of inherited this name that's not actually his real name and sort of run with it. And he uses that, as readers will see, to he'll use anything he can to motivate himself or psych himself up. And that it's almost like WWE wrestling, where a wrestler has a stage name. And it's obviously very different than, professional wrestling, which is fake and not a real sport. But yeah, it's part of this thing that he incorporates into his basket of psychological tricks to motivate himself, I guess. And so when the mistake happens, he sort of just lets it happen, and it further pushes him along on his mental trajectory.
Yeah, I also feel that brought a little bit of comic relief at points to the book. And one thing you bring up professional wrestling, and again, let's tie in the Minnesota thing. The governor, one of the governors of the state, Jesse Ventura, not his real name. That is his persona, and that's basically what he's adopted over the years. I mean, it's definitely not his real name, and I'm wondering, how does Jesse Ventura get to be Jesse Ventura on the ballot? But that's another conversation entirely. But as we wrap things up here with Gabe Habash, the author of Stephen Florida, a novel available at Coffee House Press, some of course other books, Amazon.com is where I got it, but coffeehousepress.org/shop/Stephen with a PH-Florida. Is that okay? First of all, from a author's perspective, where would you prefer people buy this so we can tell them to go to the right place?
You should buy it from Coffee House directly, because it's an independent publisher and you support independent authors. And if you don't want to buy it from Coffee House, if you have a local independent bookstore, call them up, or maybe they have it in stock. Those are the preferred ways to do it.
Okay, so I didn't help you by buying this thing on Amazon, did I?
No, you didn't. No, you can buy it on Amazon too. There's no right or wrong way, but yeah, it's always good to support independent publishers and independent bookstores. So that's the way we like to go.
So with the book being done, you've got a tour going through the rest of the month. This is the time we record this on June 23. I mean, what's next for you? The other books, I mean, how long do you ride the wave here in terms of a book tour and promoting something before you get on to your next project?
Right. So I'm on the West Coast now. I had a reading at Powell's in Portland, Oregon last night, and I'm going to California to do some more events with my wife, who's also a novelist. Her book came out in April. It's called Marlena, and it's by Julie Bunton is my wife's name. And so we've been sort of going through this whole process together. And we have some book festival stuff in the fall. We're doing like the Brooklyn Book Festival and the Texas Book Festival, Boston. But yeah, I mean, it's starting. It's so interesting to publish a book because it's all this buildup for so long. Like I sold this book in December 2015, and I knew that it was going to be published in June 2017. A long time ago. So it's just all this buildup. Like, okay, well, this thing's going to happen at this point, and then the reviews start to come in, and then the interviews start to come in, and then it comes out, and you're just like, oh, well, the world is still the same. So yeah, it's starting to taper down now. So, which is good because I can maybe start thinking about what I want to do next in terms of a writing project. But yeah, it's been a great experience so far, and doing stuff like this interview has been one of the best and most exciting and rewarding parts of the whole process. So thank you for having me.
And again, you can follow him on Twitter at Gabe Habash. That's GabeHabash. And final thoughts for those who are now on the fence. If they were on the fence, what's your sales pitch to get them to read this book with a wrestling perspective? They're coming from a wrestling perspective, so that's what you're going to combat here with this your elevator pitch.
Yeah, I guess I would say that there's not many wrestling novels that are written for adults being published these days. I mean, you can read nonfiction wrestling books in spades, and like you said, there was all those books that you read growing up for younger audiences. But I hope this is a accurate and fair and insightful and entertaining and rewarding look at wrestling, because I don't think it gets enough exposure, and I did want to do justice to how much I love the sport. And hopefully if someone has been from a wrestling background, has been wrestling their whole life, and they read it, it sort of they appreciate what I was trying to bring to the table.
Yeah, there was only the one thing that we talked about. It was again, to make it timeless, you're going to deal with rule changes. Those things happen. I think if we read this 10 years down the line, like you said, you want it to be timeless, we're going to see the same type of thing with rule changes. But Gabe, it's been super enjoyable to read the book, to get the chance to talk to you about the book and give the wrestling community an insight on why a guy with no wrestling experience is writing a book with wrestling. So appreciate your time here on the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
Good conversation there with Gabe Habash, the author of Stephen Florida, a novel that centers around an athlete. It's not really a wrestling story, as we heard, but a good opportunity to read a book that has some wrestling stuff into it. And again, some of you might like it, some of you might not like it. But hey, you know what? I thought the book was fantastic in terms of giving it a good, honest read. And I think you should give it a shot as well. Right now, as I record the outro to this episode of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, I'm standing in Dortmund, Germany at, what's the name of this hotel? It's a Mercure. Basically, we're in Dortmund. There's a giant 80,000-seat soccer stadium just outside of my window. Very reminiscent to where I was standing a couple weeks ago in Lincoln, Nebraska, where there was like a 100,000-seat football stadium out of my window there. So interesting city. Haven't had a chance to see a whole lot yet, but I'm here to broadcast the European Junior Championships for United World Wrestling. So check out, if you're here in the United States, well, actually, I'm here in Germany, but if you're there in the U.S., and you go to trackwrestling.com, that's where you can watch. And if you're abroad, unitedworldwrestling.org. You can check out the feeds. I'll be doing the commentary from the finals. Be doing it solo this time. No John Cullen with me, but be doing solo. I'll be doing some spot announcing on center mat, on mat B, with some quarterfinals and semifinals throughout the course of the week. And for those of you who are members of the Matt Talk Online team, which you can join at matttalkonline.com/join the team, your gifts should be arriving. Again, still working on those hat orders. Our friends at Compound going to work those out, but we'll get those situated hopefully through the course of the next couple weeks. get those out. I'm trying to get them out before Fargo, but don't know if the hats are going to happen. But those of you who have joined the team, your swag bags have arrived. Those of you who are in year 2 or year 3, don't worry. I got some new things coming down the pipe for you in the near future. A couple shout-outs I want to say throughout the course of the week. I will not be able to attend a couple weddings that I was invited to on July the 1st. The first was Adeline Gray getting married in Denver on July 1st, so congratulations to Adeline. And my boy Eric Sanders getting married in Canby, Minnesota on July the 1st as well. Sadly, I'm unable to attend both of them because I'm here in Germany, but best of luck to both of you. Fantastic, wonderful people, and best of luck in your nuptials and where life is going to bring you. On my way over here to Germany, had a chance to read a couple books that were centered around wrestling. I read a book by Jeff Spain, who wrestled at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, for Mike Denny, called Wrestling with Business. If you are somebody who has got that entrepreneurial or business mindset, this is a book that you probably want to pick up, because what Jeff does is he talks to people, and he has stories about people from wrestling that have that mindset that he believes that wrestling has brought to him in business. So if you're interested in that type of that motivational type of stuff, or the action plans that come along with this type of thinking, Wrestling with Business, it's by Jeff Spain, How Success on the Mat Leads Success in Business. Now, the other book that I read, cover to cover very quickly, was Wrestle Like a Girl. This came out back in October by Jamie Moffitt and Craig Sesker. And Craig and I work together at USA Wrestling. He's wrote a number of books on wrestling, as has Jamie Moffitt. And this one basically is like the history of American women's wrestling, going back to the Afsoon Johnson and Marie Ziegler era in the late 80s. So this was a really, really good informational book. And this is something I feel it's almost like an encyclopedia, if you will. It's one of those books that wrestling fans should have on their bookshelf. It gives you a really good understanding of what these athletes dealt with and through the course of the 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016 Olympic cycles. So a lot of the women had to persevere and deal without funding to really do this sport that we love so much. So again, this is something I think every wrestling fan should have on their shelf and give it a read. It's a quick read, about 180 pages. I blew right through it on the plane because it was that good. So shout out to Craig Sesker and Jamie Moffitt at Wrestle Like a Girl. That was the book. Follow them on Twitter. And there's wrestlelikeagirl.org, and check it out. So that's all I got for this show. I'd like to thank you for listening, because you've always got time for short time. I'm going to learn how to say that in German by the end of it.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.